Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Executive Director of British American Business here in New York, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, A New Comms Playbook in the Age of COVID-19. This session is part of our Marketing and Communications Forum, which partners with agencies from within the BAB network to provide marketing and comms executives with the latest thought leadership and insights. These sessions are meant to be interactive and we want your input. Please do feel free to flag questions and comments once we get started. With that said, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, Benjamin Thiel Long, Director with Cognito Media. Benjamin is a communications expert with a mixture of agency and in-house experience across America, Europe, and Asia. He brings expertise and experience across corporate and consumer public relations, proactive marketing, thought leadership campaigns, and reputation and issues management. Benjamin joined the marketing community after having worked for 8 years as a barrister practicing criminal and regulatory law. Benjamin, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning from me. I am in a sunny San Diego, but as the outline has already explained, originally from the UK, where I was a lawyer, and I work at Cognito's New York office with my colleague Becca, who's also joining me, and also have the pleasure of working with Carl, who's a client of Cognito. In a moment, I'll hand over to them to give their introductions. Before I begin, with that, just a few house rules, just to let the lay of the land ahead. We'll have a discussion section around about 30 minutes where we have a few slides where we have some examples to talk you through some of the key themes and trends for today's conversation. And then from that moment, we will then hand over to a Q&A section where we'll accept questions from all of you as the audience. Just to let you know, at the moment, everybody who is listening to the webinar is in a listen-only mode. That's just to allow any interruption or interference from microphones. But we do want your questions and we do want you to contribute. So there is a question section function on Zoom, which we will try and answer either through the webinar if it's a pressing issue, or we'll save to the end to have a more discursive session. As I said, at the bottom, it is the Q&A feature. It's located at the bottom of the screen. As you hover over the Zoom menu, you should be able to find it there and you can submit your questions. We will see those, they won't be viewable to everybody, and then we'll be able to answer them at the end of the session. Also, just to let you know, the session is being recorded so that it can be shared upon request after this has been completed. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over first to Becca and then to Carl to give a quick introduction before we kick off.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Becca Cooper. It's nice to be here today. I lead digital for Cognito, and Cognito is an integrated communications consultancy. We focus primarily on the financial services and technology sectors, so very B2B focused. And my colleague Benjamin leads PR, media, and crisis strategy. So as his partner in crime, I make sure everything we do is very focused on digital and very integrated. So that means delivering everything from content strategy to social media support to influencer marketing and paid media for our clients. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Great, and thanks Becca, and thanks Benjamin, and also thanks to Cognito for inviting me to be here today, and also to the BAB for hosting the event. So I lead US Media Relations, and I'm a marketing manager for Market Access, based in our New York headquarters, although today I'm coming to you live from my in-laws' home in sunny Florida. I've been with Market Access for 11 years, spending half of that time in London building and running our marketing and communications team supporting Europe and Asia. A bit of background on Market Access. It was founded 20 years ago and really helped define the fintech landscape by being one of the early technology innovators for the trading of bonds. Our trading technology connects institutional asset managers, hedge funds, pension funds, and banks through a centralized global marketplace. Today, we're the leading credit trading platform in the world, and we have a market capitalization of around $19 billion. Now, I'll turn it back over to Benjamin.
Thank you both. Now, with a bit of technical wizardry, hopefully I can now present, and hopefully everybody should be seeing. I'm going to get a nod from Becca and Carl. Yeah, we have the slides. Good. I've passed my first hurdle, so that's always good to know. Here we all are, and also just to let you know, we have the Twitter handles, so at Cognito Media and at Market Access, as well as the BAB. So if you do want to tweet, share any of the insights today, please feel free. We will like and share back and connect with you through social media if you'd like to. Just in terms of a very quick overview, I'd like to talk a little bit about trust for the first few minutes and the trust landscape. It's incredibly important in what we do, particularly as communicators and as we build relationships with clients, customers, our staff, other stakeholders, and how some of that has changed over the last few years, but also particularly in the last few months as the world has changed with it. Then looking a little bit more granular at different elements of the post-COVID communication strategy going forward. And we'll look at media and digital, and also a little bit about crisis and issues management before, as I said, opening up to a Q&A section. Very briefly, I just want to start with some overall figures. Anybody who works in communications should be aware of the Edelman Trust Barometer. It is just an exceptional piece of research, very in-depth, very thorough, also very broad, the way that it covers sectors and topics. So whatever industry you work in, whether it is B2B or B2C, this is an index for you that you should be aware of. What Edelman do is they have a very large survey which they conduct, and then they also break it down into segment in what they call informed public and mass population. And just pausing for a moment, just so that people can understand what the difference is. It is essentially the way that Edelman break it down is the mass population, that is the general population of the world, it's global. And then informed public is a smaller section of that, which are referred to as informed. Generally speaking, those are people that have a household income that is slightly higher than average. They tend to work in a professional services job and have at least one degree of higher education. They're also high consumers of media. So these are people that consume media, either print or broadcast, every day, and also from multiple sources. And the reason they do that is, generally speaking, in terms of the informed, they make the suggestion that these people within this bracket tend to have the ability, because they get more information, to judge different sources and base trust, whereas the mass population may only get their media from one source. As you can see in the 2020 barometer, which came out in late January, just before COVID really exploded in the world sphere, the trust was showing that certainly in the informed public, trust for NGOs and businesses was around 70%. So that's what we would call a trusting landscape. These are generally trusted by those groups of people. Then, however, you get to the government and media, and it's quite low in comparison. Media is 61%, so that is just about a trusted landscape. Government actually is what we call a neutral, so it's neither trusted nor mistrusted. What is interesting about that as a first point is that those of us who are communicators, the media, and this is of course social media and digital media and print media, is that although businesses and NGOs themselves may be trusted, the sources of information for the informed public are not. So there is a level of lack of trust that is coming from our main communications outlet. That poses an interesting challenge for us. When we're working on corporate messaging, when we're working on employee messaging, we have to understand that the main vehicle by which we're communicating those messages is not one that has a high level of trust. The second, which I think is more important, is if you look at the mass population. So whether you are a B2B business or B2C, the general audiences that you're talking to operate on a much lower trust level. So particularly with NGOs or businesses, they are absolutely within the neutral element, 55%. So these are not necessarily trusted landscapes. So that means if you are communicating on behalf of one of these businesses, you're already on a bit of a back foot, because the landscape and the general view of what you have to say isn't met with a high level of trust. More importantly, when you then look at government and media, it is what we call an active distrusting network. So at 47%, the mass population actively distrust both the government and the media in terms of sources of information. This is very, very interesting for us to know that as you're going into communicating any sort of message, you need to understand that the tide is not necessarily with you as a starting point. And I wanted to test this theory because, of course, the study was launched pre-COVID and before that coming out. And so I looked more recently, and this was around about 10 days, 2 weeks ago, the team at 538, which is a little bit more political, were also doing an interesting study about communications landscape post-COVID in terms of trust. And on the left, they found one group, one source of information was given a high trust. You can see at the top, most of the respondents trusted the information. In the middle is something that is low trust, so you've got an active level of mistrust happening with this body or this organization. And on the right, it's mixed, so there was a high disparity between the different levels of whether there was trust or not. And just as a quick pop quiz, everybody to think at the moment, if you've got high trust on the left, low trust in the middle, and mixed on the right, what do we think those may be? Well, I won't labor the point, but essentially they're referring to the CDC. So again, a non-government organization on the left was mostly trusted. The president and the White House was in a low trust bracket, and the media has a high degree of mixed trust. Now, of course, in terms of the media, a lot of the driving factor with that is the fact that it's quite partisan. A lot of the media is politically charged, and so that's why you get a bit of a mixture of that. But interestingly, in terms of the president and the White House, that is not politically motivated. The level of mistrust actually was coming from something else. And they asked some of the respondents, and one of them said this: the reason why there was a low level of trust is he contradicted his own health experts a couple of times, and also got carried away and doesn't sit down and think things through. And this is what is telling, this is the most important takeaway from this. Trust is lost when what you're saying does not fit the general landscape of the mood music of what's happening in the world around you. If what you're saying is directly contradictory to what others are saying, or it completely misses what the general sentiment is, or is not least understanding of that, then you are not going to build trust in that landscape. And this is very, very important to all of us who operate in a business sphere. Here is an excellent quote from the late Stephen Covey, who wrote a phenomenal book, which I recommend to everybody, about the habits of highly effective people. And he talked about trust in particular, and he pointed out that when the trust account is high, communication is easy, instant, and effective. Well, the point he's making is very simple. If you have trust, if you as a business have trust with your people, your stakeholders and your customers, whatever they may be, then it becomes easier to communicate with them. It's easier for you to get your message across, and it's easier for that message to be understood. And Stephen Covey even went into detail about how trust is built. He defined it broadly between character and competence. So if you are shown and you demonstrate that you act with integrity and have good intent, so you are fair, you are transparent in your communications, you will build trust. But also if you come from a place of a track record, if you have results, if you have credibility and show performance capability, you will also build trust. What's important is this is also a two-way flow. Trust is earned. I want that to be the key takeaway from this, because you can't just communicate in a transparent way and automatically be trusted. You have to build that. But also what is important, if you have built that rapport, if you have built trust with your audiences, it means they are more likely to judge your character and your competence in a positive way. It flows in both directions. So us as communicators need to understand the importance of, you can't just fire a message out and say, why didn't people believe me? Why didn't people take my message? If you haven't built the trust from the first place, the dynamic doesn't flow in a two-way street. And that's important for us, because when you look at some of the trends in businesses, Salesforce have done an awful lot of research about this. We know now that trust is the new business imperative. It's not how good your widgets are. It's not how quick you are to market. It's not whether you do it bigger or better, or you have a smartphone that is quicker than the others. It is, are you trusted as a business? Are you trusted? And if you are, then customers demonstrate loyalty. They demonstrate recommendation. They also buy more products and services. And the takeaway from not this slide is not the business of business is business, and it's all about what you can sell. Quite the opposite. It is important though, because if you're in business, you need to have customers and you need to sell products or services. And we know that if you build trust, customers will be loyal. They'll also make recommendations to other people and buy those more products and services. But we know now that within this landscape, the business of business is something more than that. It's about authenticity, it's about trust, and it's about connecting with your audiences. And I would be tone deaf if I sat here and said this slide in this presentation is all just about COVID. This is a general shift. And when you look at what's happening in the world right now, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, Blackout Tuesday, which is today, the understanding of different networks of people, of employees and customers, this equally applies. And we have seen some fantastic, and I was having just very anecdotally a conversation this morning with a company who have a very disparate workforce, a lot of different staff in different jurisdictions of different races, ethnicities. A lot of them, one of their team I know is a second generation immigrant, and they put a lot of positive messaging internally and on LinkedIn about how they valued all of their employees and their customers as being a family to them, and how the CEO had got personal messages from employees who were currently remote, currently very isolated, and in places such as Minneapolis where they were scared for, quite frankly, their safety, saying to the CEO how much they appreciated that message of being valued in this current landscape. Those speak messages and speak very, very loudly to those audiences, but a lot of work had gone behind the scenes. That wasn't just a message that was put up and we care. It was a constant chain that had been built over time with COVID, with what was happening with remote workforces and the general tenure of which businesses operate. You have to build on that to build that loyalty. So what does this mean? Before I hand over to Carl and Becca, who will go into some of the detail about this, it means marketers need to pivot. The trust landscape has changed. It means we're not talking about communications, we're talking about conversation now. It means we're not talking about just putting messages, but how much influence we have and how much that comes back to us. It's not about awareness, it's about engagement. Are people engaging with our content? Are they using it? Are they promoting it? Are they acting on it? And also about reputation. That has a translation into sales enablement. How are we making it easier for people to interact with us as a customer, with our people, and share their stories and build upon that to make things that are good for both customer and the business as they grow. That's the overall pivot. So I'm now going to hand over to Carl, who's going to tell us a little bit about some of the pivots in terms of communications.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. It's critical, obviously, that authenticity and trust are any communicator's top priority, particularly in today's environment when trust is really so fragile. In a post-crisis world, the pillars of the existing communications playbook still apply. So it's consistency, authenticity, defining the so what. But what's really changed is the pace in which you need to react. And despite the faster pace and the impulse to react, remember that you're still in control of your own narrative, and you still have the ability to be proactive, not just reactive. To achieve that, I've outlined a set of new pillars here to help build your new playbook. First being, know your brand attributes and be authentic to your identity. Now's not the time to reinvent yourself, otherwise you risk diluting your brand and seeming inauthentic. Next, listen to your clients and remain focused on delivering value. Internal collaboration and digital platforms will really help you manage this. Also collaborate and share resources internally. It's about working smarter, not harder. Also keep measurement and impact top of mind, so you know how and when to pivot really is needed. Also, to activate on these pillars, go digital, whether that's through social channels, email, webinars, etc. Digital allows you to measure more cleanly and pivot quickly. It's also important to remember that you're not going to get everything right. You'll need to iterate and learn, and knowing that you'll need to accept that campaigning will look very different and sometimes feel less structured than what you might be used to. Then diving into that first pillar, remaining authentic to your brand throughout a crisis is crucial. I recently saw a Nike ad that struck me, play for the world. It's empathetic to the global situation, but it still encourages activity in a period of inactivity. So the campaign is true to the Nike brand, but the tone of voice has shifted. The lesson being, be authentic to your brand and pivot your tone of voice to account for the new world in which we operate. Again, in crisis times, reinventing your identity can appear to be self-serving and ambulance chasing, or frankly, just off the mark. And while I can't claim to have the ad budget of Nike, we took a similar exercise of revisiting our tone of voice recently. And these changes really can be subtle, but they really make all the difference. Personally, for market access, in a market environment where things were changing minute to minute and financial survival was really uncertain for many of our clients, we refocused our message around partnership, connectivity, and value, and then activated that across channels. We used a letter from our CEO really as our cornerstone, highlighting connectivity and community. We then leveraged broadcast appearances that highlighted our unique insights that are driving value for our clients, instilling the partnership and value message. This then served as the basis for messaging and the tone of voice for our other spokespeople. Our other core sales-led marketing campaigns and also a new advertising campaign also highlighted the ease of trading bonds from home and staying connected. So again, kind of thinking about that holistic cross-channel approach. But at its core, this new tone of voice and our brand attributes are similar to what they were before, but they're recast in a new light and are still very authentic to our brand.
So how do you conduct a tone of voice exercise to get to where Kyle is at Market Access and the tone of voice that he created there? Here's a good example of a way to do that. It's not the only way, but we wanted to give an example of an exercise. So with this one, you could gather your company leaders, your marketing stakeholders, your comms team, and get everybody to sit down and plot individually where they think the brand voice currently is and where they think the brand voice should be. Maybe it's post-COVID, maybe it's just right now. So when everybody does 2 of these, you can kind of gather all those plots together and really see where all the points align and make some educated and informed decisions on the brand tone of voice. So once you've plotted it, you have all your stakeholders aligned, you can actually write your brand guidelines at that point and use some of these words in the tone and voice description and actually show examples of how to correctly use that established tone and voice. So as we've all been talking about, there's definitely a renewed need and importance for that customer-centric and very empathetic messaging for every brand, but you have to remember with tone and voice that it really only works if you have the actions as a brand to back it up. So you can go out there on all of your channels with an empathetic tone of voice, but if your actions don't really prove it, then it doesn't work. So just something to keep in mind.
So then thinking about the second pillar that I was mentioned earlier, listening is the key to developing impactful communication strategies. Without listening tools, you risk seeming irrelevant and disconnected. In our case at Market Access, demand for market color grew from our clients as they tried to come to grips with market volatility. The demand quickly turned to noise, and our sales team really became restless with managing that. Our research team was also feverishly responding to client demand for more data and market insights. So a lot of noise going around. Our marketing and communications team, we were really kind of caught in the middle, and we're trying to help distill some of that noise. In response, we launched Access Points, which is a platform in conjunction with our sales and research teams. Access Points is a multi-channel digital content program that focuses on market-led themes where we have unique insights. The end result is about delivering valuable insights to our clients and building trust in our brand. By listening to our internal partners and integrating their client feedback into our areas of focus, we're able to create a new, impactful campaign that ultimately delivers value back to our clients and demonstrates our partnership really with the industry.
So it's awesome that sort of Access Point came out of that internal listening at Market Access. It's an incredible campaign, but it's also very critical, not just to listen to your internal audiences, but also to be listening externally as well. So that means technology and team infrastructure has to be in place. Things like Hootsuite or Brandwatch, which are really tremendous and very powerful social listening tools that you can build queries within around your brand and your key topics so that you're constantly monitoring as a brand. And that sort of tech actually can crank out automated reports. You can look at trends over time. You can do really in-depth brand association analysis. Like this one on the right is something that we did through Brandwatch for Market Access. And you can see some of the other sort of brand associated topics that people are conversing about online around the brand. So it's critical to kind of constantly keep an eye on that sort of thing, but also tracking sentiment data as well. So you want to make sure that you're quickly jumping on it if conversation around your brand is taking a turn, and sentiment data can help with that quite a bit. And similarly, monitoring search trends. So lots of technology around that too, things like Moz or SEMrush. You can see in real time what search terms or phrases people are using to find your brand. And that sort of insight is very critical, not just to know what people are searching for to get to you, but also to feed those sorts of insights into your content strategy as well.
Then moving to our next pillars. In a crisis, it's common for teams to become reactionary and lose sight of internal resources. Time and expedience oftentimes will trump collaboration when in fact collaboration yields faster and really better outcomes. Throughout the crisis, we quickly realized that we lost many of our critical client touch points. Our sales team were really no longer able to engage clients face to face as so many other businesses were also experiencing. So Access Points was a way that we could capitalize on our insights and deliver value back to clients and help create a conversation platform for our salespeople. when we create an access point, the information flows from many places. So it's from sales listening to clients and research and data analysts feeding into that. But marketing and comms sits in the middle and defines the so what as the central partner to the campaign. By listening to our internal constituents and distilling the noise that they're getting externally, we're able to rapidly activate a client-focused content campaign. So how to activate this? It's really important to build agile teams. There should really be a structure and process to enable agility and not stifle it. Agility is often a word that gets thrown around a lot, but the intention is to empower team members and make them a part of the tangible outcome of their work. The role then of the communications team is to be that empathetic conduit to internal and external audiences. So managing the flow of information, guide the process of outreach, and also ensure stakeholders are prepared. Using access points again as the example, by bridging the gap between sales and research teams, we jointly developed a high quality campaign where everybody was a part of that process, everybody felt enabled. Then you can't really activate a proper campaign if you're not really able to measure the impact and learn how to pivot as needed. So now let's think about measurement. And what does success look like in an evolving situation? While activation and delivery is crucial, you can't really thoughtfully respond and adjust without the proper measurement tools. So serving up valuable, useful information is absolutely critical in a post-COVID era, but you need to be able to measure the impact so you can adapt as needed. Again, using the access points case study, we observed that by staggering the channel promotion of our access points, we saw a bump in unique page views, as you'll see in the chart here. So first with a client email that's targeted to specific users across local time, and then creating a social media presence in a time following. And then after that, leveraging our product, so our trading system, by distributing the content through that platform. And you'll see that we're having spikes of unique viewers every time we're doing this. We're reaching a new audience, but it's core and targeted within our user base. So learning from this, we're now leveraging this cadence strategy across all future access points and actually all other content-led campaigns. Beyond our kind of core client engagement objectives with the access points, as I was just talking about, we also realized that the external value of our insights was quite high. Because the campaign takes in a lot of data, distills it and serves it up in a valuable way, reporters were also taking notice. A great example is an April access point, which was on the new normal of the global credit markets. And interestingly, the FT ran an article which used almost exclusively all of our data and nearly copied the headline. So in terms of measuring impact, that from a PR person, that was a huge win for sure. Thus, impact measurement should be viewed across channels. It's not just listening to your digital platforms, social channels. It's also about looking at media indicators as well. And again, remember, work smarter, not harder. Use your content to its fullest potential and amplify it across channels.
Yeah, so that, I mean, look at that. The headline was basically taken from the access point to an FT article, which is pretty incredible. And that's
I was very proud of that, Becca.
definitely a KPI that like Kyle's taking to his leadership team, right? And that's great that you have those things to report and you should be constantly monitoring that kind of communications. But Kyle is smart because he's taking it to the next step, right? He's taking it to what is the impact of that article? What is the impact of all that channel distribution of the access point and the impact of the earned media? So when you think about post-COVID communications, when it comes to measurement, we can't rely on the typical KPIs that we have. Things like impressions, click-through rates, video views. You know, leadership doesn't want to see just a bundle of KPIs anymore. We have to, as communicators, be thinking about how we're measuring our marketing and comms efforts and in terms of how they actually impact the business. So use the metrics that you have from that owned content, from the earned media, even from maybe other people talking online about the content, and create formulas internally to prove to your leadership team actual business impact, or prove to your own team so that you can pivot if there is no impact. At Cognito, we measure impact for our clients through 3 ways, through growth, through influence, and through behavior change. And we create formulas for each of our clients using their KPIs and using our qualitative assessment of what's happening to deliver that kind of impact measurement. So doing an exercise like this will really force your marketing and comms team to think about what really matters, first of all, and then to focus on those metrics in order to make the pivots you have to when you need to do that. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about digital channels and listening and measurement. One of the key things here is that, in this COVID crisis, and especially for B2B brands that we work with, this has just been a humongous digital inflection point for everybody. So digital really is now the central pillar in communications playbooks. And McKinsey released this really awesome study last month that, this is the data on the left, that shows that B2B companies see digital interactions as really 2 to 3 times more important to their customers than their traditional sales interactions. So it's just proving that everybody is online, as we know, and that digital communication and content marketing is critically important. It's no longer just an amplification of your owned assets or your earned assets. It has to be the most central and powerful tool in your comms toolbox going forward. And that also allows you to manage disruption quickly, manage uncertainty if you are digital first and digital ready.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, again, at Market Access, using the Access Points case study that we've been talking about, the program was born out of this new remote working from home environment. So it's really intentionally digital first. When we build a channel strategy for distribution and amplification, it matches that. So we're always thinking about the web page that we're building, how flexible and interactive can that be? How can that then translate to social? How can we use all of our channels at our disposal? Also, as highlighted previously, we were able to make actionable observations based on our measurement tools. So Access Points drew unique traffic from a mix of channels organically, which helped determine our cadence. And we really wouldn't have been able to see this trend as quickly as we did without listening to each digital channel and then measuring the impact.
So in addition to listening to your own channels and watching the impact on your own channels, you also have to keep an eye on larger trends too, right? Because the world is changing very quickly right now. So it's really important to be cognizant of what's happening out there. For example, this chart on the left is from one of our partners, our tech partners, NewsWhip. This shows that when COVID hit, you can see this just like record engagement numbers for some of these core publishers on Facebook in particular. So we actually use NewsWhip to monitor sort of like the bigger picture and do predictive analysis on topics that are about to take off, what platforms they're about to take off on. It's a really powerful tool, and a lot of publishers actually use it to stay on the pulse of what the conversation is, which is really important. And then likewise, just, from a broad strokes, every social channel is seeing record engagement at the moment, record usage. It's all increased dramatically in the last few months. LinkedIn in particular is seeing a huge jump in engagement and conversations and content creation, even in their online learning space. People are taking tons of courses. So all of that is an opportunity. For us, having B2B clients, it's made us open our eyes for our clients and think about Facebook and Instagram, or even Instagram Live, which are channels that we didn't typically think about for B2B audiences, but we are now. And, we're thinking about things like Instagram Live sessions and pivoting channel strategies, because there's so many more eyeballs on these channels daily. And it allows us to really test and learn on these new channels as these engagement rates are changing all the time. So you're listening to larger trends, and you're listening and measuring your own, your owned assets and all of your paid media. But how do you know as a business if you are really digital first and digital ready? And how do you make sure that digital is a central pillar of your comms playbook? Well, this is something that we use at Cognito to really make sure that our clients are digital ready and to help us help them get their digital house in order. So when we start working with our clients, we really assess them across two axes here, and we're assessing their business and also their channels as well. So the first axis is really about the business's value proposition. How is the business going to market? What is the outward facing view of the world? Is it differentiated in the sector? That's a really important thing to consider, especially in that external messaging that a brand is putting out. And then likewise, we're also assessing sort of like internally within the business. What is the infrastructure that the brand has? Do they have a digital or tech team? Who are the people? Is the technology there? Is it an agile organization? And by plotting where all these things stand with the business, we can kind of figure out where a brand falls within one of these four quadrants. Are they digital leaders, or do they really just have to get the fundamentals in order to get started? And that allows us to figure out, okay, well, depending on where they are, we can see what tactics will be optimal to get them started, to be prioritized, and to get things moving in the right direction.
So kind of bringing this back to the point that I made a little bit earlier, campaigns will look and really feel quite a bit different moving forward. One kind of concept that we constantly talk about at Market Access is surround sound. It's not necessarily a new concept of communications and marketing, but it's really now more important than ever. As Becca was just highlighting, there are multiple distractions in today's environment, and information seems to be coming from every angle. With access points, again, as our case study, we're activating each post across channels to maximize our reach. But the tone and the intention of each post is around delivering value and not overtly selling a service. So keeping our focus on value creation bolsters our brand and is communicated consistently across all those channels. So taking stock of the communications channels that you have at your disposal and using each channel to focus on delivering authentic value back to your clients will ultimately build credibility in your brand during times of crisis.
Yep, totally. So people are just overwhelmed with content at the moment. So delivering that value is critical, but brands can also use this like sort of post-COVID time and this marketing environment to really build loyalty with their audiences and with their customers. And I think a really great example of this is like the airline industry, right? They're not doing well at the moment. And this is a good example of a really smart campaign from an airline. It's actually Thai Airways. And I love this. It's their Thai Stay Home Miles Exchange. And they released a huge ad campaign that shows, it actually urges flyers to download their app, and it monitors their locations, which sounds a little creepy, but it's private. And when people stay put in their homes for certain amounts of time, the airline actually gives them points and credits. So it's such a good campaign because even though no one is flying, the brand is using that time to stay engaged with its customers in a productive and helpful way, and rewarding them for loyalty. So super strategic and an awesome example. So I did want to touch on this very quickly, just sort of on the digital front. It's important when we talk about campaigning to talk about paid and search campaigns too, because things are a little nuts out there. So across the board, you can see on the left, this is an eMarketer study, paid media and advertising budgets have been slashed just across the board. A lot of brands are slashing their budgets. But at the same time, like I said earlier, engagement on all these channels is much, much higher. So what that means for paid media, especially on social that we're seeing, is that there's much less competition. So rates are dropping significantly. On some channels, we're seeing CPCs drop as much as like 30 or 40%, which is lower than they've ever been in years, to be honest. So this is a big opportunity for brands, especially when it comes to paid media. We might have less budget to spend, but there is actually more value to gain. And it's opening the door for a lot of different paid testing opportunities for our clients as well. So that's on the paid media side. On the search side, everybody should be conscious that Google actually very quietly updated its algorithm in May. And while Google is notoriously very vague about what changes to its algorithm actually are, just looking at the data, we know that they did this because it's a reflection on just how dramatically people's search behavior is shifting, especially over the last few months. So we think it's an effort to like really weed out fake news, shifting to very, very relevant and useful content, very up-to-date content. The chart on the right shows, just how the shift in traffic on Google has shifted to certain sectors: news, #1, business, #2, things like travel and real estate dropping to the bottom. So when you think about your actual AdWords campaigns and your search marketing campaigns, it's critical to be constantly reviewing them, to be keeping an eye on your campaign efficiencies, your keywords, pausing low volume keywords. People are searching differently, so you have to stay up to date with that, and how those search queries are evolving, and reflect that in your search campaigns as well.
Thanks, guys. So just rounding this off, I just wanted to talk about issues and crisis management really briefly. And I've seen a lot of garbage out there, quite frankly, that says that COVID has completely changed crisis communications. I don't agree. For those of us who have practiced in issues and reputation management for years, have always known that authenticity and transparency are the North Star of communicating in an issue or a crisis, and that listening and collaboration are the biggest and strongest tools in a communicator's arsenal. The only thing that has changed is the general sentiment of the public and the general issues that are important to them. That has always been the case, because when you are doing issues in crisis management, the first thing you need to do is understand the world around you in the conversations and make sure you're not missing that. As my grandmother taught me, 2 ears, 1 mouth, listen twice as much as you talk. Sorry, it may sound vernacular, but it's 100% the truth, and it applies to what we do in issues and reputation management. You build that process by having a strong playbook. That's always been the case. A strong, well thought through playbook will have issues and scenario planning. You need to be very honest about your organization's strengths and weaknesses, and also those can evolve. As a business, you may grow in geography, you may grow in service line, you may grow or change in the way that you work. So for example, a lot of businesses have now gone from offices to remote working. That could be temporary or it could be permanent. Either way, that changes your crisis playbook, because you have different issues to consider. You'll also have different channels and different ways of communicating with your staff. You can't, for example, get everybody into a physical town hall. You need to set up a Loom video. You need to set up a Zoom chat, whatever it may be. That has to go into the playbook, and that has to be understood. And the ways of reaching people, having a clear chain of command, knowing who the chief person for risk or legal or IT is, all of those things are vitally important. Because at the end of the day, if you have an issue or a crisis, it has to be reacted to quickly, swiftly, but as thoroughly as you possibly can. If you don't know who to communicate with and who to call and who to make sure is aware of the scenario, you are not going to be able to deal with that in an effective way, and you're going to be putting out information that's inaccurate. And the thing that I feel very, very passionate about is that you also need to have that playbook somewhere that everybody can reach it, because I can guarantee you, having been in that experience, the difficult phone call is not going to come at 10 o'clock in the morning to the CMO after they've had their nice cup of coffee and had their breakfast. It's going to come at 5:20 on a Friday when half the office are out, and it's the most junior person who's taking that difficult call. And guarantee it happens all the time, because journalists also know how to play the game. Everybody needs to understand where that playbook is, who to communicate with, what the holding patterns are, and what the messages are, and what the overall strategy should be. Even if it's not in detail, it should be known in broad brushstrokes. And I'll get off my soapbox for one moment. But that includes going to what's inside. So things like the communication playbook, understanding messaging Q&A, understanding how to respond to those difficult, but also knowing the different business lines and geographical areas. And I think in the increasingly disparate world that we are working in now with a lot of remote working, understand that you have to communicate internally very, very quickly to make people aware that an issue may be evolving is vitally important, and often is the primary consideration before responding to that journalist request, which, let's face it, can wait an extra 20 minutes at most days, no matter what the time is. Scenarios in detail, these will evolve, and you need to make sure that your playbook is updated and evolved on a constant basis. But you need to have scenario planning for things like data breaches, because let's face it, whether you are B2B or B2C, data breaches now are a new normal for everybody as a concern. That is something that didn't impact by COVID. That was always the case, but it has grown. Things like system or service outages, product defect, recalls, any injuries or illness at work, whether it's employee or customer, and also things like industrial action. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. These are just some starters for 10, not what a general business will focus, and you may have any more. And I'm seeing Carl nodding, like he in his own will have particular issues around systems outage, for example, because it will impact different people in different ways and different times. You need to have that broken down and understand how to react, because it will be a different response for different things like that. And just very, very high level, people often ask me, what does a playbook look like? Well, this is the type that I use. This is a very broad template. Remember, these are guidelines. They're not train tracks. So I'm not saying everybody create a playbook that looks exactly like this. Also, every time you're looking at a scenario overview, so say, for example, you have a systems outage, this is your overview for here, that gives the overview here. The considerations will be different. You might have one for your North America business and one for your EMEA business, because you may act, let's take a bank, for example, you may be more branch-based in the US, you may be more mobile or online-based in EMEA. Those are different scenarios and different considerations. You need to have a different plan for that. Understanding the strategy, will you be proactive or reactive? What are the likely media questions? How long will the outage last? Are you working on it at the moment? How many people are impacted? Is it all of your services? These are just basic questions that people should be tested. And I know it's difficult. This is a hard exercise. But another lawyer lesson that I always learn is that, as a lawyer, you always ask the questions that you already know the answer to. You don't go for surprising. These should not be a fishing expedition when you're preparing for a crisis. So thinking these through, employing an outside agency to guide you through that is always wise, whether it is a comms agency, whether it's a strat agency, whatever it may be. But whatever it is, this has to be a thorough, in-depth explanation, and then understanding those specific issues and messaging that needs to be constantly evaluated and updated throughout the process. It's also then important when you come to understanding about leadership. I'll pass to Carl for a moment, but ultimately, leaders need to understand, and their biggest concern, if they are to be the media face of an interview, when there's been an issue or crisis, they need to be as informed as they possibly can, because a surprise question will never be a good one for them. They'll never be able to answer it thoroughly. And that's why all of this is important, because these are the people that rely on us to be spokespeople for the business.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And one thing I would add to that too, Benjamin, is that the regional impact of a crisis playbook is really important, because the regulatory obligations also might be quite a bit different. So making sure that you have the proper risk and legal teams involved is quite crucial, because there might be different requirements in different regions as well. I've learned that with being in London at the time when MiFID II was going live, so it was quite a big exercise. But again, talking about spokespeople here, and this really probably feels like an obvious one, but consistency of tone of voice for all your spokespeople is crucial in a time of crisis. And that might mean refocusing the priorities of each spokesperson, or in fact, maybe limiting back your bench of spokespeople itself. So you might have to make some critical decisions there. But really the importance here is that you're conveying a sense of empathy while remaining true to your brand. And that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, exactly, Carl. And I'm just going to just give a quick flag that we're now coming sort of the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, please ask them. I can see a couple popping up. But what I wanted to finish is that, I completely agree with Carl. I think the other element to that is that you don't need to be different. Communicate in the way that is most true to you and with the tone of voice. And tying all of this together, I wanted to just leave two examples, because everything that Carl and Becca have been talking about in terms of all the digital, the communications, the media, it distills down to this. COVID is not a chance to completely reinvent the way that you communicate. And two wonderful and effective examples of that, Jacinda Ardern, who I'm constantly impressed with her leadership and her ability. She's only the second female leader of a world nation to not only give birth while in office, which itself is an extraordinary feat, but to be able to then do that and walk straight into a national disaster like COVID. Prior to that, there was a terrorist bombing in her nation. She handled each of those scenarios with a clear, impassioned, consistent, and natural tone of voice and a natural empathy. Similarly, on the other side, you have Andrew Cuomo, who is empathetic, but more of a leadership style. You can see he's very clear in the way that he takes control. But that doesn't mean you hold all the aces and you don't speak to anybody and say, here's what we're doing. You watch his briefings, he's articulate. He puts up slides that say, this was our thought process. He says, these are the conversations that I had with the MTA, and these are the challenges that we're together working out. And we don't have the answers but we will. He's very open. Those are two very different styles of communicating, but both equally effective. And you look at the way that, you know, Andrew Cuomo has been absolutely looked as a real guiding light in the United States as an example of how to communicate. But you look at Jacinda Ardern, just because she's been more empathetic doesn't mean she's been less effective. New Zealand is the first country to open up as a result of the strong measures that they took in relation to that. So the style will change from person to person, but as long as you build on those messages, as long as you're authentic and transparent, and you have all of these things that we've been talking about, making sure that you're also aware that the media is there to ask the difficult questions, so you're fully prepared, you will have the best response that you possibly can and show the leadership that you need in all of your communications. So I'm going to hand over to questions, and a first one, which I'm going to hand actually over to Kyle. First of all, the question is that we're now in a phase in which businesses are reopening, and they are thinking about how to do that. What's the balance, and what's the right balance when you're focusing a sort of a long-term marketing strategy where you have goals that might have already been in place before the pandemic, while then attending to the current content and issues that you may have changed as a result of the initial? How do you merge those two, and how do you face them together?
Sure. So, I mean, market access, I mean, our world is really the institutional finance world. It's all business to business. So we're not necessarily opening physical doors necessarily. But what I would say is that it really gets back to one of the pillars of listening. So I think it's listening to your constituents, to your clients, but equally it's very much about listening to the market and what's going on at the time. So a product launch that you might be building a campaign for, let's say in January, that might be on the shelf now because it's just not the right time. The market isn't ready. It's operating in a different function. And now's not necessarily the time to try and pivot behavior, as an example. So I think it comes back to listening and shaping your priorities around that most effectively. Because again, it's about the authenticity and the trust that you're trying to build in that, and you're trying to demonstrate that you're listening to the market, your clients, and your internal stakeholders.
Thanks, Carl. And Becca, another question which is for you. Different countries, and within that also different regions, often face different challenges when responding to the pandemic. Is there a need, the question asks, is there a need to create more local or regional targeted marketing campaigns, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, so not to copycat on Kyle's answer as well, but I do also believe that this comes back to listening. You know, there's a lot of technology where you can drill into different regional conversations and sentiment and like what is happening around certain topics and areas. It depends on your business jurisdiction. It depends on, you know, what regions you're trying to focus on. But if those regions are very different, and an easy way to discover that is just through some simple social listening, then absolutely you should be communicating differently to those different regions, either of this country or internationally. You know, for instance, with all of the protests and everything that is happening right now, every city is very different in terms of, you know, the scale of it, and brands are, you know, taking a stand, and that's important. But it is important to listen to what people are saying in each of those cities and reflect as a brand, you know, something that is authentic and empathetic to what is the conversation, you know, regionally.
Thanks. Keep those questions coming in. They're absolutely superb, guys. We have another one here. And I'd be really keen to hear Becca's thoughts. Well, I have some initial ones actually as well. The question asks that we're clearly now in an age of high polarization, and businesses and organizations and even individual teams are overwhelmed on social media, sometimes for not taking a public stance. And what do you think about that? The question goes on, especially if taking a stance on one side may alienate another, given that things are so polarized. As a business, how do you best strike that balance? And how do you deliver that message in an authentic way in the time of crisis? Not just during the pandemic, but for example, with protests of killing of George Floyd, when the space is already saturated with messaging around this. I'll hand over to Becca in a second, but my first reaction to that is, if you respond, and if there is messaging around an issue like this, it comes back to the point of what is the message and what is it that you have to say that's of relevance to your business and your people. And the example that I gave from that earlier in relation to the client that we work with, you look at their first message about this. They didn't put posts on LinkedIn saying, we're outraged and we're shocked about this particular incident. What they did is they realized that their people of different races and backgrounds and color and ethnicity will be concerned about their own safety. So their message in response to this was to show out a message of support to their internal team and their people, to say that we support you, that you're part of our family, and we value everything that you do, and we want to make sure you are safe. That is what we talk about authenticity. That is a message that generally reflects what it relates to a business and shows value. And the proof of that was the fact that staff wrote to the CEO and said, we value and support that. I'd like to pivot another example. I thought this was an interesting one. Le Labo, which is fragrance homeware brand that's very popular, and it's hasn't ever been political, but it's always very engaged in social issues generally. The night before last, I think it was, in Soho in Manhattan, their shop window was broken. None of their store was damaged, other than that things weren't taken, it wasn't looted, but the whole of the glass pane was broken. And they put a post on social media and it said, "We understand that sometimes glass has to break in order for people to be heard." That's an extraordinary sentiment, very well thought through, and very much acknowledges the fact that they, as a business, understood why it happened. It wasn't angry, it wasn't stirring anything up, but what it did is acknowledge that that glass had been broken because of a reason, and it was a reason that they understood, and they supported the voice and the ability for people to share their voice. That, again, is authentic. It doesn't put them in a polarized position. It doesn't make it political, but it acknowledges that there is a voice that needs to be heard. And quite frankly, it went on to then share a quote from advocates of the Black community, quite pointing out that racism, quite frankly, has no place in 21st century society. It's possible to do that by sharing it in an authentic way that links back to you as a business. Becca, I don't know if you have some further thoughts on that.
Yeah, similar. My initial thinking around that question is don't just put something out there. You have to do the due diligence and go internal first, especially with a polarizing issue like this. You have to talk to your team and, talk to your leaders and really, have that discussion internally about what is going on before you can even think about coming out with a brand statement or a stance or whatever it is. It's important to have those discussions first. And then, yes, if you, as a team, you feel strongly you want to say something, for sure, put that out. But if you are saying something publicly as a brand, your actions have to back up your words. You can't just put like a social tile on social media, which I saw a lot of brands do yesterday in particular. Target is another really good example. Just leaders in this space right now, especially being based in Minneapolis, a lot of their stores are being destroyed. And the CEO of Target came out and said, we will rebuild the stores. We support all of the protests. Not only that, but we are going to continue to pay all of our staff, pay and benefits for as long as this takes. And we will donate to organizations and et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important to have the conversations internally around this issue in particular, but to also back up your words with actions.
Yeah, and to build on that, I would just say that it's really about being intentional. So being very intentional with the word choice that you have and being able to make sure that you're backing that up with what's true to you and your identity. Again, crisis times aren't a time to reinvent your image. So just add that.
A final question, which I think we can deal with very shortly, and I think this is a great question. It's saying that providing transparent and ongoing communications is the hallmark of good crisis communications, but sometimes things change daily or weekly, and how can you strike the correct balance? Well, the answer to that is simple, and it's about listening. It's about understanding what is happening in the world around and saying something when you have something meaningful to say in response to that. Realistically, you need to think about recognize, regret, and resolve. You need to, if there is an incident that you need to understand and recognize that it's an issue, you need to show the regret and the remorse as a result of that, and then how you are dealing with it and how you're resolving with that. You don't need, and this is sometimes difficult as communicators, to keep repeating that message just for the sake of it. You need to understand what the mood music is around. And if you are doing that, if you are listening and realizing and recognizing there's something that has to be responded to, then you're probably doing the right thing. It can be difficult, but if you're doing it in an open way, then that is the best way to make sure that you're responding in the right time. We're reaching the top of the hour now, so I don't see any more questions coming through. So I'm just going to say a very quick thank you on behalf of Cognito to the BAB and also all of you for listening. We're hugely grateful for this opportunity to speak to you and share our thoughts with you. Please find us on social media. Please please find us through the BAB, and please find us through our individual emails, as you can do if you have other further questions. BAB would be delighted to facilitate that and help that if you have any difficulty. But from Carl, Becca, and myself, a huge thank you to everybody for organising this and attending it, and I'll hand back to the BAB team for any final thoughts.
Thanks, Benjamin, Kyle, Becca. That was really informative, really interesting. Thank you for relating it to, current events. And yes, exactly. If anyone would like to be connected, we're happy to facilitate that. And please look out for the next session of our Marketing and Communications Forum coming to you in the fall. Take care, everyone.